In this lecture, I want to finish talking about Aristotle's specific list of virtues. The only big one on his list that we haven't talked about is justice. So we'll begin talking about justice, say at least a little bit of what he thinks justice is. Then we'll move on to, thinking about, are there some things that are maybe missing on his list? Are there some important virtues that he doesn't mention that we think should be there? Might we define some virtues differently than he does? Might we axe a few of the virtues on his list, get rid of some of the ones he lists? And then I want to say a few things about the relationship between these virtues. I want to come back to this claim about the unity of the virtues that I touched on in an earlier lecture. I want to come back to it and just kind of fill it in more. Okay. So justice for Aristotle means giving people what they deserve. In outline, I think anybody would say that's what justice is, but Aristotle's views of justice are a bit different than some of what ours might be. For Aristotle, justice is very tied to situations and personal relationships. Some set of hard and fast, clear rules are not really going to cover justice. It's very particular, it's very tied to one's situation. It's very tied to the relationships one has with other people. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, for one thing, Aristotle would say justice prefers those who are close to you. It is just to prefer your brother or your father or your mother in a way that you don't a complete stranger. And it would be unjust to treat your father in the same way you treat a stranger, right? If you have to choose who of two people to help, a complete stranger or your father, all other things being equal, you should help your father. Part of justice is that you are concerned with him in a way you aren't with other random people. Justice takes the relationship into account. It's just for a person to give more concern to their own children than it is to complete strangers, right? I mean, look, Aristotle wouldn't take this too far. He wouldn't say if it's a matter of, saving a stranger from drowning or helping your dad plant a garden that you should let the stranger drown so you can help dad. No, of course not. But, when everything is equal, you should prefer dad or you should prefer your own children, right? If it were a matter of, helping your father do something around the house or volunteering for some worthy but not especially pressing cause, Aristotle would say you should help your dad. If it's a matter of buying Christmas presents for your own children or giving money that you could use for Christmas presents for some charity, Aristotle would say the just thing is to prefer your own children, right? In the same way, Aristotle would also say it's unjust not to have some particular attachment, some special attachment to your own city or country. So for Aristotle, justice isn't just some set of rules. Justice is going to be very complicated, very nuanced, but it will take your personal relationships into account. If you don't take them into account, Aristotle would say that's unjust. Anyway, there's a lot one could say about Aristotle's views on justice. As I said, it's very nuanced, it's very subtle and complicated, which means I'm not going to try to cover it in any depth, because if I did, it would probably take 3 or 4 lectures of its own. So we'll just kind of talk about it very quickly and leave it aside. Well, now I want to talk about the question, what do we think of Aristotle's list? Now that we have all the virtues on the table, now that we've seen how he defines them, what do we think of Aristotle's virtues? Look, nothing makes Aristotle's list sacred. You know, virtue theory, thinking about character and the virtues is an approach to ethics. Aristotle is the most influential form of virtue theory, but you can be a virtue ethicist, you can take this approach and part company with Aristotle on a lot of the things he says about particular virtues. So, you might like the virtue ethics approach, but you might want to say drop wit and friendliness as virtues. Maybe you're more comfortable with them as virtues than I am. I'm not sure I would think of them as virtues. You might want to redefine some of the virtues. As I said, we might put good temper a bit closer to, failing to get angry, never getting angry than Aristotle does. We would probably put proper pride closer to humility than Aristotle does. Probably more important than either of those, we might add some virtues. There seem to be some really important virtues. I'm sure you can think of, a list of your own that aren't on Aristotle's list. Kindness, for instance, that seems to me to be a very important virtue. Now, generosity seems a lot like kindness, but they don't seem to me to be exactly the same thing. Loyalty, for instance. Loyalty, given the way Aristotle defines justice, loyalty's kind of part of it, but it seems to me there's something to be said for loyalty as its own specific virtue. If you like the Aristotelian approach, it's probably a good thing to think to yourself, well, what virtues would I add to Aristotle's list? Because I don't think this is quite a complete list. One final thing I want to talk about in this lecture is just to revisit this unity of the virtues claim. Remember I said before that Aristotle thinks the virtues take account of each other. Well, he actually goes a lot further than that. He actually says the virtues require one another. If you truly have one virtue, Aristotle would say you have them all. More than that, if you completely lack any one virtue, Aristotle would say you can't have any of them. Well, what do we think of this? Is it really true that if you lack generosity, you can't be brave? Or if you lack proper pride, you can't be temperate? I don't know. To some extent, I think this is plausible, right? The virtues, I think there's a lot to be said for this claim that the virtues take account of each other. A lot of times when we talk about why someone failed to have one virtue, it's natural to mention the fact he lacks other virtues, right? Why is someone a hothead? Why is he rash? Why does he get into fights and face danger when he shouldn't? Well, part of it might just be that he doesn't have good temper, right? Part of it might be that he doesn't have proper pride. As far as good temper goes, he's what Aristotle calls irascible. He's a hothead. As far as pride goes, he's arrogant, right? That might explain why this person is willing to put himself in danger for stupid reasons. And in the same way, a lot of times when we talk about someone lacking, say, the virtue of justice, the fact that they're not, say, generous enough will be a natural explanation, right? The person who insists on the letter of a contract even when he knows it might bankrupt the other person to keep it, and the person's in difficulty through no fault of their own, well, that doesn't really seem just. Justice would be waiting a while to make this person pay you back if you don't really need the money. And precisely why this doesn't look just is that this person doesn't take enough account of generosity, right? So there is something to this idea. Problem, though, here is this sets the bar incredibly high. To say that you have to have all the virtues to have any of them, well, then very few of us are going to come out to be virtuous, right? Even many people I know who seem exceptional in one virtue very clearly lack some others. And Aristotle would say, well, if they lack some others, they only look exceptional in these other virtues. They don't really have them. I don't know about that. I am very uneasy with that claim. Now look, Aristotle could say, well, you don't have to have, remember, people have the virtues to different degrees. You don't have to be perfectly just to have the virtue of generosity, or perfectly generous to have the virtue of justice, maybe. You just have to be far enough along the line that you have the virtue of generosity, right? That you don't lack it to be just, and vice versa. And then so on with the other virtues. There's something to that reply, but I still think this sets the bar really, really high. So I'll stop there, but this is a theme, this is a criticism that I'm going to pick up in the next lecture when we kind of zoom back out and take a more high-level view of Aristotle's theory, because I do think there is something to this idea, not just here but elsewhere, that Aristotle sets the bar very high. Maybe he sets the bar too high.